Vanakkam Namaskar. My name is Sanjay Madrasi Pandey and you are watching our show Rastram. You must have watched the viral video from Tawang where Indian Army Jawans are seen beating the intruding Chinese soldiers into pulp while hurling choicest slangs at them in chaste Punjabi. Now follow it up with Rahul Gandhi's inimical comment on the latest India-China skirmish in Northeast Frontier Agency NEFA. Our soldiers are being beaten up in Arunachal and we cannot even ask questions about it.
प्रेस वाले आज सब सवाल पूछेंगे, आगे पीछे दाएं बाएं, यात्रा, सचिन पायलट, अशोक गहलोत, सब पूछेंगे। मगर चाइना के बारे में एक सवाल नहीं पूछा जाएगा। जिन्होंने 2000 स्क्वायर किलोमीटर हिंदुस्तान का उठा लिया, जिन्होंने हिंदुस्तान के 20 जवानों को शहीद किया, जो हमारे जवानों को अरुणाचल प्रदेश में पीट रहे हैं, मैंने कहा हिंदुस्तान की प्रेस मुझसे इनके बारे में एक सवाल नहीं पूछेगी।
I'm a bit confused, Mr. Gandhi. When you say our Jawans, which army are you referring to? Indian Army or the Chinese one? I guess it is the latter. By the way, did you change sides after signing the secret MOU with Communist Party of China or before that? Some Chinese stooges in India, however, were quick to point out that the viral video was 1 year old. Well, that's even better because it depicts the already changed attitude of the armed forces towards Chinese aggression. For the first time, the change of attitude was witnessed during the 2020 Galwan clash, where 20 Indian and 42 Chinese soldiers were martyred. Though India was honest enough to admit the killing of its 20 soldiers in the Himalayan skirmish, a cunning and heartless China initially outrightly denied the supreme sacrifice of its brave sons, saying that there was no casualty of PLA troops. Facing severe backlashes from its own people, China reluctantly admitted that their 4 Jawans were martyred in the clash despite independent sources claiming 42 casualties. The Galwan clash was a clear indication of the change in India's resolve towards China, making it apparently clear that the Nehruvian era of getting bullied, humiliated and saying sorry to the aggressor was over. Mr. Rahul Gandhi, allow me to take you to 1959 when the Chinese were actually beating up Indian forces, usurping our land, and your great-grandfather was angry with the media for reporting the same. August 28, 1959, New Delhi. Jawaharlal Nehru sets out for Sansad Bhavan from his official residence Trimurti Bhavan. A visibly angry Nehru stares out of his car window at the media persons who had published the news about Chinese incursions in the northeastern borders, something his government had managed to carefully conceal from the public so far. The news reports had blown the lid off the Chinese attack on Indian troops at Longju in NEFA, Northeast Frontier Agency, aka Arunachal Pradesh, pronouncing the futility of the much-hyped Panchsheel Treaty signed between India and China in 1954. As India's first Prime Minister, Nehru was no stranger to wars, bloodsheds, gang rapes, mass murders and destruction. Yet, he turned a blind eye to the annexation of languid snow-lion Tibet by raging dragon China in 1950 and thereby bringing deceitful PLA at the very doorsteps of India. Despite several domestic crises crippling the country, PM Nehru sought to carve a place for himself on the international stage. Nehru believed that he was the inheritor of MK Gandhi's legacy of non-violence and as an elder statesman had a global role to play in post-colonial era. Till early 1949, China was not a security concern for India. The only external security threat that was there was Pakistan. Nehru, the self-styled proclaimed champion of non-violence movement, often talked about disbanding the army as, according to him, the police were good enough to govern the country and handle the external threats too. Now, if Nehru said the same thing today, he would be ruthlessly branded a pappu like his great-grandson, Rahul Gandhi, who has become the butt of the joke after stating something similar. If farmers and laborers are strong, India does not need to deploy armed forces at the borders. Anyway, let's switch back to 1950, when China's Mao Zedong was preparing for a major showdown with the US Army in Korea and had also announced his intentions to annex Tibet. As the international community slept at switch, the PLA made a bold move into Tibet on October 7, prompting the buffer state to seek help from friendly India. The Nehru government rudely turned down Tibet's appeals and asked them to sort out the matter with China peacefully. Only Bhure Sahab knew what that even meant. In fact, the Indian establishment was clueless about the crisis staring at them. With the fall of Tibet functioning as a buffer state between the two Asian giants, the stage was set for the Chinese incursions along McMahon Line drawn between India and the Himalayan state of Tibet. Brigadier John Dalby, who himself participated in the 1962 war, says in his book Himalayan Blunder, India was in a quandary. The entry of the Chinese troops in Tibet had potentially ominous long-term consequences. Tibet had become a buffer zone vital to British India's strategic defense. The abrupt removal of this buffer would alter the geopolitical balance, and henceforth India would have a live northeastern border to reckon with. There was a definite possibility that Tibet would be used as a springboard for aggression against India whenever it suited the communist regime in China. Prior to the annexation of Tibet, B.N. Malik, the then head of IB, had warned the Nehru government about China's intentions and prodded it to consider a military intervention to derail the dragon's nefarious designs. Nehru asked General Cariappa for his views. The latter categorically stated that the Indian army was not capable of handling such military intervention on behalf of the Tibetans. It was not only Malik who was calling for a hard line against China's expansionist policy. Home Minister Sardar Patel also advocated a showdown with the dragon. Minister for Industry and Supply Shyama Prasad Mukherjee and a few others echoed Sardar's sentiment on the issue. Here goes the excerpts from Sardar Patel's letter to Nehru on November 7, 1950. My dear Jawaharlal, I have been anxiously thinking over the problem of Tibet, and I thought I should share with you what is passing through my mind. The Chinese government has tried to delude us by professions of peaceful intention. There can be no doubt that the Chinese must have been concentrating on an onslaught on Tibet. The final action of the Chinese, in my judgment, is a little short of perfidy. The tragedy of it is that the Tibetans put faith in us. They chose to be guided by us, and we have been unable to get them out of the meshes of Chinese diplomacy or Chinese malevolence. From the latest proposition, it appears even though we regard ourselves as friends of China, the Chinese do not regard us as their friends. During the last several months outside the Russian camp, we have practically been alone in championing the cause of Chinese entry into the UN. We have to consider what new situation now faces us as a result of the disappearance of Tibet. Throughout history, we have seldom been worried about our northeast frontier. The Himalayas have been regarded as the impregnable barrier against any threat from the north. We had friendly Tibet, which gave us no trouble. The Chinese were divided, they had their own domestic problems and never bothered us about frontiers. That throws into the melting pot all frontier and commercial settlements with Tibet, on which we have been functioning and acting during the last half a century. While our western and northwestern threat to security is still as prominent as before, a new threat has developed from north and northeast. Thus, for the first time after centuries, India's defense has to concentrate itself on two fronts simultaneously. In my judgment, the situation is one which we cannot afford either to be complacent or be vacillating. Any faltering or lack of decisiveness in formulating our objective is bound to weaken us and increase the threats which are so evident. I suggest we meet early to have a general discussion on these problems and decide on such steps as we might think to be immediately necessary and direct quick examination of other problems with a view of taking early measures to deal with them. Yours, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. Unfortunately, Sardar passed away within a month after writing this letter. His departure made Nehru's functioning even more autocratic, as there was no one else to put a leash on him in the party or in the government. Furthermore, his ongoing posturing against the West robbed India of the possibility of military or financial aid in the event of hostility with the Chinese. Pakistan was already in the camp of the West, which thought it was important to balance the power equation between India and Pakistan. Nehru brushed aside concerns of defense experts on the imminent threat from China. He did not get a wind of the Chinese incursion in Ladakh when China built a highway through Aksai Chin in 1957 and usurped around 38,000 square kilometers of land from India. In 1959, Nehru said most Indians wouldn't know where the Aksai Chin was when grilled about his abject surrender to China. Let me try to give you a little trivia about Aksai Chin. Situated in the northernmost portion of the Indian subcontinent, Aksai Chin is a part of the Union Territory of Ladakh that lies in the northeast of Jammu and Kashmir. The contested piece of land is almost the size of Bhutan or a little smaller than Switzerland. Most of Aksai Chin, a cold desert flatland that does not receive rain or snow and is mostly uninhabited, is under China's occupation for the last 6 decades. The Dragon first captured this barren piece of land during 1950s and consolidated its military grip over the area during the 1962 India-China War, thumbing nose at India's attempts to settle the border disputes peacefully. China occupied Aksai Chin, claiming it to be part of the ancient and medieval Chinese Empire. This claim, however, does not hold water. In the 1660s, the Mughal Empire extended to Ladakh. 2 decades later, the rulers of Ladakh and Tibet signed a treaty. So if Ladakh was an integral part of Tibet, what was the need of Tibet signing a treaty with Tibet? After the British colonizers took over India, the rulers of Tibet and Kashmir signed another treaty in 1842, confirming that Ladakh was part of Kashmir and controlled by its government. Dogra chief Maharaja Gulab Singh had conquered Ladakh in 1834 and made it a part of Kashmir state. Kashmir, along with Ladakh, came under the British in 1846. Thereafter, the British drew up the boundary of Ladakh and Tibet. Eventually, the government of India inherited the territories and boundaries of British India in the subcontinent as decided by the Indian Independence Act. Interestingly, China did not object to Ladakh or Aksai Chin being part of India until a couple of years after 1950, when the Indian Constitution adopted the whole of Jammu and Kashmir as an integral part of India. Historian Ramchandra Guha opines in his book, India After Gandhi. No official Chinese map showed Aksai Chin as part of China before the 1920s. A Xinjiang map of the 1930s showed the Kunlun, the mountains, rather than the Karakoram, the range, to have been the customary boundary, which had been India's claim all along. Celebrated French journalist Claudie Arpey, who authored The Fate of Tibet When Big Insects Eat Small Insects, cites US intelligence agency CIA to show that Chinese policy in Aksai Chin shifted in 1952. After the communist regime took over China in 1950, they planned aggression beyond the western boundary of Tibet through a network of 3 roads to be built under military supervision passing through Aksai Chin. One of these 3 roads is highway number 219 that connects Hotan in Xinjiang to Lhasa in Tibet. Despite the ongoing hostilities with India, China has recently announced its plans to build its second highway by 2035, passing through the disputed territory of Aksai Chin. Claudie Arpey also cited a CIA document to say that the Chinese military first made its appearance in the east of Ladakh, that is Aksai Chin, in 1951. The construction activities, however, began only after 1953, when Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai had become the slogan of India-China friendship. By 1959, the myth of friendship had been busted. The proponent of Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, Prime Minister Nehru, was busy diplomatically asserting India's sovereign right over Aksai Chin. Blinded by his one-sided love for Chairman Mao, Nehru was caught sleeping at switch. 5 years before the India-China War, Chinese newspaper Kuangming Ji Pao reported on October 6, 1957, the Xinjiang Tibet, the highest highway of the world, has been completed. It reported that a number of trucks were running on the highway on trial basis, arriving in Tibet from Xinjiang. In 1958, then Foreign Secretary Subimal Dutt wrote to Nehru saying there was little doubt that the newly constructed 1200 kilometers road passes through Aksai Chin. China strengthened its position in Aksai Chin after the 1962 war and set up the LAC entirely unilaterally in Ladakh, including the Galwan Valley area, where a violent face-off took place in June 2020. In 1962, the Chinese troops were stopped by the Indian soldiers near the present-day LAC in Ladakh. Unlike the northeastern sector where the invaders had come down to Tejpur in Assam, when China announced a ceasefire unilaterally, it retreated to the McMahon Line in Arunachal Pradesh but held military control of Aksai Chin. According to a 2010 article of PLA Ground Forces, the Chinese leadership of the 1960s considered the occupation of Aksai Chin as a brilliant move coming out of the strategic vision of a great man, Chairman Mao. It argues that Aksai Chin is like Damocles' sword hanging over India's head, in addition to being a gateway to the Central Asia and an easy route to easily run over New Delhi. Hope I have been able to explain why China was keen on seizing Aksai Chin. On the Arunachal Pradesh border also, China built massive roads and military infrastructure on their side of LAC, while lulling the Nehru government into complacency with hollow assurances of peace and proclamation of thousands years of friendship between India and China. But when the truth dawned on callous Nehru, he tried to hide his Himalayan blunder from the nation. Prime Minister Nehru was so desperate that he did not hesitate to lie in Parliament when the issue came up on April 22, 1959. He told the House, "We have discussed one or two minor frontier disputes which comprise tiny tracts of territory, maybe a mile this way or a mile that way, in high mountains where nobody lives, and those are pending." While the fact was that the Chinese had not only usurped the entire 38,000 square kilometer area of Aksai Chin, but they had also built a military road through the disputed territory. Despite the Chinese betrayal, Nehru turned down the offer for a permanent seat in the UN Security Council and instead lobbied for granting the same seat to China, dishonoring Sardar Patel's suggestions. Since then, as you know, India has been struggling for a permanent seat in the UN Security Council, and guess who blocks India's bid? It's Nehru's Chini Bhai. Not only that, China, the all-weather friend of terror epicenter Pakistan, has been blocking India's move to add Pakistani terror masterminds into UN designated terrorist list. In April 20, 1960, the Chinese government offered to recognize India's claim over Arunachal Pradesh up to the McMahon Line in return for India's recognition of China's claim to the Aksai Chin. Nehru rejected the offer and adopted an inflexible diplomatic posture on the border issue. An indecisive Nehru left these festering geopolitical wounds to worsen that would grow into a major security threat in the coming days. A year before the 1962 war, during a debate on Aksai Chin in Rajya Sabha on December 5, 1961, Nehru had made a rather infamous statement. "It is a territory 17,000 feet high where not even a blade of grass grows. It is useless, uninhabitable land. Did not even know where it was." Mind you, Nehru said this at a time when China was invading, infiltrating and occupying Aksai Chin. Nehru's heartless and naive remarks invoked immediate sharp rejoinder from Congress leader Mahavir Tyagi, who angrily pointed to his bald head and quipped, "I am bald. Does it mean I will abandon my head?" Nehru came under severe attack in Parliament again on November 8, 1962 for supporting aggressor China's admission to the United Nations. Justifying his another Himalayan blunder, Nehru came up with this nonsense. "It is not a question of likes or dislikes. It is a question which will facilitate Chinese aggression and misbehavior in future." There was solid proof that China was preparing for an onslaught on India, but Nehru never suspected that China would ever launch an attack. Much to the dislike of the self-proclaimed global leader, India was attacked on October 20, 1962, and as was expected, the Indian army was not ready for it. As a result, 10 to 20,000 ill-trained, ill-equipped, ill-prepared Indian troops were made to face an 80,000 strong Chinese army who were high on morale and armed to the teeth. The Chinese had been planning and training for this Himalayan showdown for a decade. Needless to say that India faced a crushing defeat in the 1962 war, as we were no match for the mighty Chinese army. Our Jawans, however, fought very valiantly. More than 1,000 brave hearts laid down their lives and hundreds were taken prisoners. The month-long war ended on November 21st as China unilaterally declared a ceasefire in sync with its infamous salami slicing strategy. In Arunachal Pradesh, China retreated to McMahon Line, but in Ladakh there was no McMahon Line. Hence, they unilaterally decided the line of actual control, taking full control of Aksai Chin. In 1963, Pakistan gifted another 5,000 square kilometers of Aksai Chin territory to China, thereby laying the foundation of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Brigadier J.P. Dalvi, who was taken prisoner during the 1962 war and had spent 7 months in Chinese custody, writes, "On the night of 21st November 1962, I was woken up by the Chinese major in charge of my solitary confinement with shouts of good news. He told me that the Sino-Indian war was over and that Chinese government had decided to withdraw from all areas which they had overrun in their lightning campaign. When I asked the reason for this decision, he gave me this Peking-inspired answer. India and China have been friends for thousands of years and have never fought before. China does not want war. It is the reactionary Indian government that was bent on the war. So the Chinese counter-attacked in self-defense and liberated all territories of NEFA and Ladakh in just 1 month. We have now decided to go back as we don't want to settle the border problem by force. We have proved that you are no match for mighty China." Prior to the Chinese invasion, the prevalent political and military thinking was that there could be no war with China in Nehru's lifetime. The Chinese were our friends and the only combustible issue was the undemarcated Indo-Tibet border. India was therefore taken by complete surprise politically, diplomatically and strategically. The initial reaction to the Chinese invasion and our reserves was one of shock, disbelief and indignation. India's distinguished President Dr. S. Radhakrishnan summed up the feeling of the nation succinctly when he exclaimed, "We have been negligent and credulous." Later, Nehru expressed the view that the Chinese had treacherously stabbed him in the back. In a radio talk at that time, he said, "I am aggrieved at the setbacks to our troops that have occurred on the frontier and the reverses we have had. They were overwhelmed by the vast numbers and big artillery, mountain guns and heavy mortars which the Chinese had brought with them. Over the years, half-truths, rash promises had been made to assure people that the country was prepared for a military showdown with China. But the decisiveness of our defeat made it painfully clear that we were caught napping and had tried to bluff our way out of the crisis that was partly our own making. When Nehru's Chini Bhai stabbed him in the back, the PM, pursuing his foreign policy on promises and assurances that China will never attack India, tried to put the blame on the army, subjecting the armed forces to a good deal of uninformed criticism and even ridicule. The government, however, did not have the courage to admit their own blunder, turning blind eye to China problem, failing to equip forces with modern arms and ammunition, providing them adequate training, building infrastructure along the LAC, and so on. In the wake of a crushing defeat, many heads were bound to roll. Defense Minister Menon resigned on November 7 after massive protests in Parliament and within the Congress party, questioning Nehru's protege's ability to handle the defense portfolio during the critical years of 1957 and 1962. His mentor Nehru, however, tried his best to retain Menon by designating him Minister of Defense Production, but he had to eat a humble pie and withdraw his decision after angry protests in the House. This was the first time Bhure Sahab had bowed to the will of people of India, signaling erosion of his vice-like grip over the people and the polity due to his blunders and omissions of China policy. After Menon, it was time for Chief of Army Staff General Pran Nath to go. He resigned on the grounds of health, only to be rewarded with the ambassadorship of Afghanistan. Lieutenant General B.M. Kaul, the commander of the ill-conceived and ill-fated 4th Corps, was compelled to seek premature retirement, a bitter pill for Nehru to swallow, as Kaul was widely believed to be his protege and military confidant. The Chinese announced their intention to withdraw from the occupied areas not before giving India's international standing a near mortal death and altering its national political scene forever. Nehru and his ministers were touring when Chinese first intruded Thagla. Nehru was attending the Commonwealth Prime Minister's Conference in London when the Chinese first intruded into Thagla area. He did not deem it necessary to return and take charge of the situation as head of the Defense Committee of Cabinet. Nehru's absence was a grave handicap in the sphere of high direction of war. It is amply clear how serious Nehru was about the danger at our doorsteps. He proceeded to Lagos, Nigeria from London and returned to India only on October 2nd. After taking the unfortunate decision to appoint General Kaul to command the non-existent force, Nehru gaily left for Colombo on 12th October and returned 3 days later. His second trip at the height of the hostility with China proves how serious he was about the border situation. In fact, before alighting from the plane, he told the press that he has ordered the army to evict the Chinese. With what, Mr. Nehru? World War II Chinese weapons? Canvas shoes? Little or no ration? And no reinforcements? It seems to be an unpardonable dereliction of duty on the part of Nehru, the executive head of the state, his advisors, and the intelligence agency. Aware that India would never resort to aggression, China keeps bullying us on the border with incursion, intrusions, building up army bases near the LAC and so on. But China must keep it in mind that this is not the India of 1962, which meekly surrendered to its bullying. Since 2014, there has been a sea change in India's China policy. In the 2020 Galwan clash, India showed the world that it could counter China's aggression on its own without being a rudderless crybaby as it was during the Nehru regime. India is now able to stare into the eyes of the bullies and browbeat them into retreating to their cave of cowardice. Not because our Jawans were cowards then and they have become suddenly brave now. It is because of the incumbent government's clarity in identifying an enemy and giving them the taste of their own medicine. India had to pay a hefty price for neglecting Sardar Patel's suggestions on how to counter Chinese aggression in NEFA and in Ladakh in 1962. But the incumbent Modi government seems to be following the Iron Man's suggestion in letter and spirit. The infrastructure blitzkrieg in the so far neglected and terror-hit Northeast has rattled China badly. Xi Jinping now knows that India is gradually heading towards a position from where it can give the dragon a bloody nose in the event of a clash, incursion or bullying at the borders. The Communist Party regime seems deeply perturbed by construction of roads, tunnels and bridges across the Northeast, particularly near the flashpoints. Strategically important Sela Tunnel is being constructed at a height of 13,000 feet in Arunachal Pradesh and is likely to be ready by January 2023. Once completed, this 2-kilometer tunnel will provide the Indian security forces an all-weather access to Tawang near China border. At present, the connectivity between Assam and Tawang gets affected during the winter due to excessive snowfall at the Sela Pass, crippling movement of army vehicles and others. Unlike 1962, when Nehru buried his head in the sand of ignorance, the current dispensation is showing the mojo to counter any future Chinese misadventure. In the past few years, India has increased its defense budget, keeping the threats in mind. The armed forces are being equipped with modern weapons, High-frequency radar systems are being installed, laser-guided cutting-edge missiles, drones, artillery guns, and tanks are being deployed in the sensitive border areas. But that's too little, if not too late. In order to compete with China and guard our 2,100-kilometer long border with the enemy state, we need more resources to match up with what the far-sighted Chinese had built way back in the 1970s. This means we need to ramp up our defense budget. At present, China's defense budget is over 3 times that of India's budget. While India's defense budget for 2022 was $70 billion, China's defense spending stands at $209 billion. Now, one might argue that China's economy is 5 times bigger than India. But when you go to the battlefield, what counts is how well equipped, how courageous, and how far-sighted you are. Nobody would take pity at your financial conditions and resource crunch. It is true that India's resolve and response during the recent violent clashes has surprised the Chinese strategic community. If a scrapping of Article 370, pronouncements of taking back Aksai, growing alliances, and infrastructure surge all along our northeastern border was not enough, India's growing alignment with its adversaries in the US, Japan, Australia, Vietnam has made China very uncomfortable. To deal with a resurgent India, Chinese hardliners suggest a policy of 3 no's. No weakness, no concession, and no defensive defense. In other words, China should take all opportunities to crack down on India, take the initiative to hit it hard where it hurts the most, by supporting the cause of Maoists, Naga separatists, or Kashmiri terrorists. Much to the dislike of Xi Jinping regime, the recent Chinese actions and reactions in places like Galwan Valley, Tawang, and Doklam have stoked nationalism in India and united the otherwise divided nation against China. If the India-China ties are damaged beyond repair, experts say India alone or in association with other countries will cause endless trouble for China, leading to fall of the communist regime that has ruled the vast Asian country with an iron fist for the last 7 decades. Well, that sounds like wishful thinking. We cannot make our defense policy based on that, like Nehru did in 1950. Hence, the global statesman left his borders defenseless, undeveloped, keeping India's borders open for enemies with red carpet to invade. For many years, independent India had a policy that the best defense is not to develop the border, that undeveloped borders were safer than the developed ones. That's why there was no construction of road, airfields, or anything on the Indian side, while China went on an infrastructure blitzkrieg on their side of the border. If you think I'm making that up, hear it from the horse's mouth.
Independent India, many years as a policy on border, best defense is not to develop the border. Undeveloped border is more safe than developed border. So many years there was no construction of roads, airfields, nothing in the border areas. By that time, China continued to develop their infrastructure in the border areas. So as a result, now they have gone ahead of us. Compared to us infrastructure-wise, capability-wise, in the border areas, they are ahead. Admit that. It's a part of history.
For good, this wicked and flawed strategy of Indian government has changed in the past few years. There is a construction boom on the Indian side of the border too. Now India is building the capacity to counter Chinese aggression, making sure that Nehruvian Himalayan blunder is never repeated again.